In a relationship with a narcissist, the final discard does not arrive like a blow, it arrives like an icy void. No explanation, no closure, not even a period at the end of the sentence. You are not pushed out. You are erased from the story, as if you never existed. And it is precisely this clean disappearance that takes your breath away. You don't cry because you lost them. You panic because you cannot comprehend how someone who once looked at you as the center of their world could turn away so quickly. You begin combing through memories, every message, every moment, just to find proof that you were ever real. But to a narcissist, you were never loved as a human being. You were a psychological function, a mirror that allowed them to see the version of themselves they needed to believe in. As long as you reacted, hurt, explained, tried to understand, you were still working for the architecture of their ego. The final discard only happens when that energy begins to run dry, when your eyes no longer beg, when your presence no longer makes them feel safe, when being near you starts to provoke unease instead of reinforcement. At that point, they do not see you weakening. They feel themselves destabilizing. And a narcissist will always abandon anything that risks forcing them to face the emptiness inside. What hurts most is not that they find a new source of supply, but the feeling of being replaced so easily. Yet the truth is this: you were not replaced, you were removed because you were no longer usable. You began to develop boundaries, silence, an inner life of your own, and that shattered the role they needed you to play. The final discard, therefore, is not their victory. It is the moment they realize you are no longer a place where they can hide from themselves. And here lies the paradox. The very thing that makes you feel utterly abandoned is the first sign that you have stepped outside their control. You hurt not because they left, but because for the first time you are standing alone without anyone defining your worth. That pain is real, and it runs deep, but it no longer pulls you back toward them. It pulls you back toward yourself. The final discard is not the moment they close the door on you. It is the moment you are no longer held inside a role that was never truly yours. Part 1, final discard, is not a breakup, but the moment the narcissistic ego moves to self-preserve. The final discard does not begin on the day they leave. It begins much earlier and far more quietly, at a point deep within the narcissist's inner world that is difficult to name when being with you no longer makes them feel as safe as before. On the surface, everything may still look normal. They continue talking, remain present, may even show care. But inside, a small fracture has already formed. That fracture appears the moment you begin to change in ways that no longer serve their psychological structure. You react less. You no longer panic in response to their coldness. You stop automatically taking the blame. You no longer organize your emotional life around keeping them from leaving. For you, this may feel like exhaustion, a final limit, the moment you no longer have the strength to keep abandoning yourself. But to the narcissist, this is the most dangerous signal imaginable. This is because the narcissistic ego is not sustained by inner strength. It exists through constant external reflection. They need your gaze to know who they are, your emotions to feel valuable, your pain to maintain a sense of control. When you begin to withdraw these, even slightly, they do not interpret it as your growth, but as the approach of their own collapse. Being with you no longer reinforces them. Instead, it activates a deeply uncomfortable emotion they cannot contain: emptiness, disorientation, and exposure. You become a mirror that no longer distorts, and precisely for that reason, you reflect what they fear most, the truth that behind the persona there has always been a void that was never filled. At this stage, many people mistakenly believe the narcissist becomes distant because they are bored, because they have found another option, because they are done with you. In reality, what is unfolding inside them is far more complex and unstable. They begin to feel unsafe around you, not because you have weakened, but because you are no longer easily manipulated. Your presence activates a primitive fear, the fear of being seen without being able to control how they are seen. And for a narcissist, being seen in this way is not intimacy, it is an existential threat. The final discard, therefore, is not an act of punishment, nor a display of strength. It is a survival-based, self-defensive reflex of the narcissistic ego. They must retreat before the mask fully collapses, before they are forced to confront the shadow they have spent a lifetime running from. Cutting you off does not heal them. It merely postpones disintegration. But they have no other choice, because staying would mean enduring the emptiness without someone else carrying it for them, and that is something the narcissistic ego cannot tolerate. For you, however, the experience is entirely different. You do not feel this defensive mechanism. You only feel a sudden and brutal abandonment. It feels as though you have been thrown out of a reality into which you poured your faith, your emotions, your life. You are not only in pain because you lost them, but because everything that was real to you could be erased so easily. Yet it is precisely at this point of pain that a difficult truth begins to surface. They could not stay when you began to become yourself. The final discard does not happen because you were not enough, but because you reached a limit the narcissistic ego could no longer control. And even though all you can see right now is loss and emptiness, at a deeper level something crucial has already begun. You are no longer sustaining an empty psychological structure, but stepping out of it. Even if that step hurts so deeply, it feels as though you are collapsing along with them. Part 2. The moment the final discard occurs. The cold withdrawal of a panicked ego. The final discard does not unfold in rage, nor does it often come with a clear confrontation. It arrives cold and clean, and that very coldness makes it feel as though the power has been cut to your entire reality. One day, you realize you are no longer checked on, no longer sought out, no longer present in their life in any familiar way. Not because there was a clear breakup, but because you are left suspended in a void where every connection that once existed is suddenly severed without explanation. For the narcissist, this is not intentional cruelty, it is a survival move. When all attempts to pull you back into your former role fail, and your presence only triggers unease and a vague sense of shame, withdrawal becomes the only way to preserve a persona on the brink of collapse. What makes the final discard so devastating is not that they leave, but the way they do it, as if you never truly had a place at all. That sudden disappearance strikes directly at your sense of existence, causing you to question whether you were ever loved, ever seen, ever meant anything. But for the narcissist, cutting you off is the fastest way to extinguish an internal threat. Being with you no longer makes them feel powerful. It forces them to feel their own fragility. And because they cannot remain with that feeling, they slam the door shut, not to defeat you, but to avoid a deeper collapse. In the moment of the final discard, the narcissist often rewrites the entire story to protect their ego. You may be given labels that feel foreign to you, too difficult, too emotional, no longer compatible, or simply treated as a mistake that must be erased. Diminishing you in their perception does not reflect who you are, it reflects the level of panic their ego is experiencing. By turning you into the problem, they avoid facing the truth that they themselves are losing control. For you, the final discard often triggers a very specific kind of pain, not only the pain of losing the relationship, but the pain of being left with countless unanswered questions. You want to understand what happened, to know where you went wrong, to hear an explanation clear enough to close the story. But their silence is not disrespect. It is a psychological limit. The narcissist cannot give you closure, because to do so, they would have to look directly at what they did and feel the shame they are incapable of tolerating. The final discard, then, is not merely the moment they leave. It is the moment the entire structure of illusion upon which the relationship rested is abruptly cut off. You are left feeling disoriented, but within that void, a difficult truth begins to emerge. Their departure does not define your worth, it exposes their limits. And even though all you can feel right now is pain and emptiness, at a deeper level, the final discard has closed, a role you never truly chose, the role of being a refuge for an ego that is afraid of itself. Part 3, after the final discard. The void they leave is not meant to break you, but to wake you. After the final discard, the first thing you feel is not freedom, but a strange emptiness, as if a familiar rhythm of your life has suddenly been removed. You wake up no longer waiting for messages, no longer scanning their moods, no longer bracing yourself to keep a fragile connection alive. Yet it is precisely this absence that unsettles you. For a long time, your identity had unconsciously revolved around reacting to them, adjusting yourself to them, existing within their frame of reference. When the final discard happens, it is not only the relationship that ends. The psychological structure you had been living inside collapses with it. That is why the pain you feel now is not simply missing them, but a deep disorientation, as if you no longer know who you are when you are no longer standing in the old role. But if you look deeper through a Jungian lens, this is the most dangerous and sacred moment of all. When the narcissist withdraws, they take with them the persona you once mirrored for them, but at the same time, they leave behind a void where the parts of you that were long suppressed begin to surface. Before, you had no space to listen to yourself, because all your energy was absorbed in regulating someone else's emotional world. After the final discard, for the first time, you are forced to be alone with feelings that were never allowed to exist. Repressed anger, unpermitted grief, and the exhaustion of having gone too long without being yourself. This void is painful, but it is not meaningless. It is the place where your old ego begins to dissolve to make room for a more truthful inner structure. At this stage, many people become trapped in the question of why, believing that if they can just understand the narcissist's motives, the pain will disappear. But the truth is this: no explanation from them can heal you. The final discard cuts off the possibility of closure through dialogue, forcing you to close the chapter through truth. And that truth is hard to accept, you loved, with your whole being, in a relationship where the other person was never capable of showing up as a whole human being. When you begin to see this, the pain does not vanish instantly, but it changes its nature. It no longer pulls you backward. It pushes you forward, even though every step feels heavy. The final discard, therefore, is not a punishment inflicted on you, but the final limit of a distorted structure. It ends the role of being the mirror, the refuge, the life source for an empty ego, and returns you to yourself in a state that is fragile but real. This moment does not feel like victory, nor does it come with clear light, but it brings something more important: truth that is no longer distorted. And from that raw truth, the process of individuation quietly begins. You are no longer defined by how much someone needs you, but begin learning how to exist without erasing yourself to keep a relationship alive. Part 4. What the narcissist never anticipates. The final discard does not destroy you, it ends their power. There is a cruel paradox the narcissist never sees when they carry out the final discard. They believe that by withdrawing, disappearing, cutting off completely, they have reclaimed ultimate control. In their mind, you will collapse, become confused, search for them, and continue orbiting their presence even after they are gone. And for a while, this may be true. You hurt, you feel empty, you are disoriented. But it is precisely at this point that a completely different process begins, quiet, irreversible. When the narcissist disappears, they do not only remove their presence, they inadvertently remove the role they once occupied in your inner life. And for the first time in a long while, no one stands at the center orchestrating your emotional rhythm. At first, this feels like free fall. You do not know what to hold on to, because before, nearly every reaction, decision, and feeling you had was shaped directly or indirectly by keeping that relationship from collapsing. But over time, that very emptiness begins to reveal a difficult truth. The narcissist's power never resided in who they were, but in your emotional participation. When the final discard happens, that participation is severed brutally, and at the same moment, their power begins to dissolve. They may find new supply, they may rebuild another narrative, but what they never regain is their central position in your inner world. Through a Jungian lens, this is the moment your ego begins to reorganize. No longer trapped in reflecting another person's persona, the neglected parts of you start to return the capacity to self-sense, to self-define, to stand on your own without needing an external gaze to confirm your existence. This process is not comfortable, because it requires you to face pain that was never allowed to surface before, but it also brings a different kind of freedom. You no longer need to prove your worth by being chosen, retained, or desired. That worth begins to be felt from within slowly, delicately, but authentically. And this is what the narcissist never anticipates. The final discard does not create a permanently broken person. It creates someone who is no longer easily manipulated. As you gradually emerge from obsession, as their silence no longer triggers panic, but becomes a cold fact of the past, the relationship loses its psychological power. They may still exist somewhere in memory, but they no longer define who you are. From this perspective, the final discard is not a killing blow, but the final limit of narcissistic influence. After that moment, the story no longer revolves around what they did to you, but around how you are learning to live without having to disappear so that someone else can remain. Part 5. When silence becomes sovereignty, the point of no return. At some point after the final discard, you notice something unexpected. The silence no longer terrifies you. Before, their silence felt like punishment, a tool that made you doubt yourself, shrink yourself, chase after them to fill the void. Now, that same silence becomes the space where you begin to hear yourself more clearly. This is a pivotal moment that very few people realize they have crossed, because it is not loud, it does not feel like victory. It feels more like a deep inward retreat. You no longer wait for them to return, nor do you need them to disappear completely for you to feel at peace. They simply no longer occupy the center of your psychological reality. For the narcissist, this is the true loss of control. Not when you are angry, not when you are suffering, but when you no longer need to react. The narcissistic ego exists only through reflection, through emotional participation from the other side. When you naturally withdraw that participation, without hatred or retaliation, the entire invisible power structure begins to collapse. They may not recognize it immediately, but at a deeper level they sense that a door has closed in a way they cannot reopen through any familiar role. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment you step out of participation mystique, the unconscious fusion with another person's inner world. You no longer live within their emotional rhythms, no longer allow their story to define who you are. Silence is no longer the absence of connection. It is the sign of psychological differentiation. You begin to exist as an independent individual, with boundaries, with your own rhythm, with a reality that does not require validation. This does not make you colder. It makes you more real. And it is here that the final discard completes its deepest meaning. Not because the relationship ended, but because power has fully shifted. The narcissist may still exist somewhere with new stories and new sources of supply, but you are no longer an extension of that structure. Your silence is not a weapon, it is sovereignty. It marks the point of no return, where you no longer need to disappear, shrink, or react to keep someone else from leaving. From this moment on, the relationship becomes a memory placed in its proper position, and you step into a different reality, one where your presence no longer depends on whether someone still needs you or not. Part 6, after the final discard. You did not Get over them. You outgrew your former self. There is a common misunderstanding about the stage after the final discard. Many believe healing means you no longer think about them. The truth is deeper and far more difficult. Healing is not erasing them from memory. It is when that memory no longer has the power to define who you are. After the final discard, what truly collapses is not only the relationship, but an old version of yourself, the version that believed love meant endurance, that attachment had to come with anxiety, that being chosen required self-erasure. That collapse is painful, because it does not just take away a person. It dismantles an entire belief system you once relied on to survive. Through a Jungian lens, this is when individuation truly begins. With no one left to reflect, you are forced to face your own shadow, the part of you that accepted too much, stayed silent too long, sacrificed beyond its limits. You can no longer place all the blame on the narcissist, nor do you need to turn it against yourself. Instead, you begin to see the whole picture. Why you stayed, why you tried to save a structure that could not be saved, why you once confused emotional intensity with love. This awareness does not arrive like a flash of light, but like a deep exhaustion where you no longer want to fight, no longer want to prove anything, only to live truthfully with yourself. And here is where the story fully turns. The narcissist survives by pulling others into their loop. You, after the final discard, step out of that loop, not through force, but through understanding. You no longer need them to recognize you, to regret, or to apologize in order to close the chapter. You understand that if they had been capable of staying and facing themselves, the final discard would never have happened. And that understanding cuts the final cord, the cord that no longer lay with them, but once lived within you. Seen from this ending point, the final discard is not your failure in love, but the final boundary of a lesson. You do not become numb, you become discerning. You do not close your heart, you build boundaries for your soul. And most importantly, you no longer seek your wholeness in anyone else's gaze. When the narcissist disappeared from your life, they believed they had ended the story on their terms. What they could not see is this. The story only truly ended when you no longer needed them to stay in order to be yourself. From that moment on, you did not merely survive the final discard. You stepped beyond it, carrying a new ego, with fewer illusions, more truth, and for the first time, belonging fully to yourself. Part 7, the final truth. The final discard does not end love, it ends illusion. After everything, there is a quiet truth you only reach once the pain has passed its most violent phase. What ended was not love, but a long-held illusion that you could be seen, kept, and loved within a structure that never had space for truth. The final discard does not take away your future. It takes away the false story you lived inside for far too long. That is why it hurts like a loss. Yet at a deeper level, it is a necessary removal. You did not lose someone capable of staying. You lost the belief that if you tried hard enough, sacrificed enough, endured enough, their nature would one day change. At this point, you no longer need to understand the narcissist in order to keep moving. You understand enough. You understand they did not leave because you were not good enough, but because the truth you carried exceeded what they could tolerate. You understand that love cannot exist where everything revolves around protecting a fragile ego. And you also understand that what kept you trapped was not them, but the version of you that believed you had to trade yourself in order to be chosen. When this becomes clear, a strange calm begins to settle, not because you won, but because you are no longer in the game. Seen from here, the final discard is no longer the central wound of your life story. It becomes a marker the moment you left a relationship without carrying the curse of repeating it. You do not need to freeze your heart, nor do you need to distrust every future connection. You only carry a new discernment. Real love does not require you to disappear, and any relationship that demands you shrink Remain silent to survive, or lose yourself to keep the peace, no matter how long it lasts, ended long before the final discard ever occurred. When you stand at the end of this journey and look back, you no longer ask why they left or whether they regret it. The only question that remains, the only one that truly matters, is how you will live when you no longer need to prove your worth to anyone. And the moment you choose to live honestly with that question, the final discard completes its ultimate meaning. Not the end of love, but the end of an illusion, so that you can begin a life that truly belongs to you. Looking back on this entire journey, you realize that the final discard was never the moment the narcissist abandoned you. It was the moment you stopped abandoning yourself to keep a relationship alive. The most painful part was not their disappearance, but the truth you had to face. You loved with your whole being inside a structure that was incapable of loving you back in a human way. Yet that very truth, however brutal, frees you from a role that had been slowly eroding you. The final discard does not steal your value. It exposes their limits. In the end, you do not emerge from this story in triumph or revenge, but in a very different kind of silence. You no longer need them to recognize you, no longer need an apology to find closure, no longer need to know where they are or how they are living to feel whole. You begin to understand that wholeness does not come from being chosen, but from no longer having to trade yourself in order to stay. And at that point, the relationship that once exhausted you loses its power to define who you are. Seen from this final place, the final discard is not the central scar of your life, but a door that closed so another could open. A door leading to a version of you with fewer illusions, but more truth, less fear, but more freedom. You do not become numb, you become awake. You do not lock your heart, you learn how to protect it. And from that awareness, a different life begins. One where love is no longer endurance, where attachment no longer requires self-erasure, and where you no longer exist to fill anyone else's emptiness. If the final discard once made you feel completely abandoned, today you can look back and see a very different truth. It was the moment you were returned to yourself. And as you move forward from here, not with resentment, but with discernment, you carry what the narcissist never will: the ability to stay with truth, to stay with yourself, and from there, to build a life that no longer needs to collapse in order to be loved.